when we talk about in vitro diagnostics at the most basic level, we are talking about tests that are performed on human samples. So these are typically blood or tissue samples that are taken from the human body. We've all had them done. It's what you have done at the doctor's office. It's what hospitals rely on as well as they're working on patients too. And these tests ultimately inform the diagnosis of the disease. It might help monitor a patient's overall health, and it might even be used to prevent a particular disease. The way that we refer to these tests has really two names right now, and it's really because of a historical FDA decision here. So we talk about IVDs and LDTs. IVDs are what we typically would refer to as commercially developed tests. That is who we at AdvaMed DX and AdvaMed as an association represent. So these are the large manufacturers. You've probably heard of a lot of them, like BD and Roche and Abbott. And they make large testing equipment that goes into the labs. They also make what are called the test kits. And these are the kits that actually perform the test for particular blood panels or whatever other items you're trying to find within the sample. An LDT is, from a practical perspective, the exact same thing, but from a regulatory perspective from FDA's perspective, they are developed and used within a single laboratory. So rather than a commercially developed test that's distributed and then used within third-party laboratories, these are the tests that labs have developed typically on their own, maybe using material from the commercial suppliers, and then they go through a process to bring them to the physicians that they serve in their practices. And in this proposed rule, FDA is laying out what is an update in its policy for how it wants to regulate LDTs specifically. And so since the 70s, FDA has actually not enforced its regulatory authorities over the LDT community, meaning the FDA medical device regulations were not applied to LDT products. FDA has decided that it no longer wants to follow its old policy, and instead it wants to update its treatment of LDTs to bring them under FDA's traditional medical device regulations. And it would basically subject LDTs to the same FDA pre-market and post-market requirements that the IVD community currently goes through. Valid really has two components to it. The first is it would bring the LDTs under FDA's jurisdiction in a certain way, meaning that the current LDTs that are out there, for the most part, would be subject to at least some type of FDA oversight. But what it also does, and really for our companies, our members, what we really think Valid is so good at, is it creates a modernized regulatory environment for diagnostic tests that do go through FDA's review process. Valid on its face would be a much better option, at least in my opinion, for the LDT community than having FDA regulate these products under their current medical device regulations. Now, that being said, I think we all would benefit from a modernized FDA regulatory approach to diagnostics. There are LDTs out there that do fit into this commercial bucket, I think, much more neatly. It's also, I'll just go right into it. It is essentially a fix for PAMA that the whole industry, and when I say that, I mean all the organizations that I mentioned before, have been working on. It's the full name of the bill is Sustainable Access for Laboratories to Services Act. And effectively, it's not a very big bill. It just adjusts the methodology that's used in PAMA. So as Andy mentioned before, the methodology is flawed. This bill would update the PAMA methodology to basically make sure that reimbursement is consistent and fair, and that we continue to have access to the lab services that are impacted by PAMA. You're looking at from close of the docket to FDA publication in the best of times, anywhere from 6 to 12 months for any particular rule, not this one in particular, but just any regulatory rulemaking that an agency goes through. Generally, they can take a lot longer too. I mean, you could see 2 to 5 years for some rulemakings, but I think FDA is keen to get this out sooner than later. I think it's highly likely the LDT community will file a lawsuit against the rule. And part of that filing would include likely some type of injunctive relief from the rule taking effect while it's pending any type of court decision. And if a stay is granted, then the rule would not become effective as intended by FDA. It would have to go through the courts. And it's a rule that, at least personally, I think has the potential to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, given some of the jurisdictional arguments that the lab community have made in the past. So this could be quite a long process, but I don't think it would be surprising if we were to see some type of LCD on CSF and blood-based testing for Alzheimer's come out soon, just given the interest and importance of the issue for Medicare patients.
This is a very important conversation that we should be having. In regards to impact on patient access to care and administrative burden for providers, this rule would significantly impact both. The rule has quite a few duplicative requirements that are already regulated under the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment Act of 1988, also known as CLIA, which I'm sure a lot of the audience members are aware of. And so our members are already having to enforce CLIA requirements in their labs, such as establishing performance specifications, quality systems, conducting proficiency testing, undergoing inspections, and then correcting and reporting laboratory errors. They're already doing that. And so if the FDA rule were to be finalized, this would duplicate all of that. Many of our members, especially at small and medium-sized labs, would have to consolidate their testing menus to very minimal amounts of tests and or face closure, which would have significant disruption for patient access to care. And especially, it would also create gaps in care for those with rare diseases and other conditions if the proposed rule was finalized. We recognize VALID was a very complex piece of legislation that would have significant regulatory changes. Part of that would be consequences for patient access to care. And so we are looking to modernizing the systems that are already in place through CMS under what I mentioned before, it's CLIA. In addition to having state level requirements and professional accreditation bodies, we believe that this approach reflects today's practices and procedures that are offered clinically, and they would be the most streamlined, cost-effective approach. Laboratory developed testing procedures are testing services that hospitals, academic, and clinical labs develop and use in patient care. So AMP refers to LDTs actually as laboratory developed testing procedures, or LDPs, as in Peter at the end, because we feel that that best reflects the services that are being provided. And our members are health professionals practicing lab medicine, and LDPs are an integral part of the care that they provide to the patients. One key distinguishing feature is the role that the professional plays in every single aspect of LDP development, validation, and performance, which greatly reduces risk because molecular pathology professionals, they have to understand every detail of the services they're providing. Typically, for traditional LDPs, they are just used in a single laboratory and they are not really commercialized. And so within the current FDA rule, we feel that it's inappropriate to treat these services provided by laboratory professionals as manufacturers. We don't feel that the FDA has the capacity to review the estimated 5,000 tests just for genetic testing alone. So we do believe that this would hinder patient access to IVD. We, again, would just point to the modernization of CLIA, as we've done numerous times, as a pathway forward for updating regulatory requirements in a way that would protect patients and support innovation during both pandemic and non-emergency times. And again, we just believe that that is the most streamlined, cost-effective approach. AMP actually did a survey of our members that was released earlier this year, and about 95% of respondents indicated that these reimbursement cuts would force them to stop offering new tests and or consolidate their menus. Widespread and equitable access to genetic testing in oncology is crucial because it supports accurate diagnoses, treatment plans, and the best health outcomes for cancer patients. There was a recent draft local coverage determination through the Medicare administrative contractors, Novitas and First Coast, that has several problematic provisions, which includes establishing parameters around when genetic testing for oncology will be considered medically reasonable and necessary. And so this is a coverage limitation that would have far-reaching implications because it would severely restrict coverage, which could lead to decreased patient access for much-needed diagnostic testing of cancers and then treatments. Also would get passed ideally, although we do recognize that it has a high cost associated with it. And so until the Congressional Budget Office were to kind of lower that score, it's unfortunately not as feasible a legislative option, at least this Congress. But we are looking forward to its passage, hopefully soon. We do think that if they do kind of rush the finalization of this rule before the election, that it is very highly likely that it will be tied up in litigation.